रब्बिश्रह ली सदरी वयस्सिर ली अमरी वहलुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली औज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम Assalamu alaikum. Inshallah, we will be doing the summary of the seventh para of the Quran. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us to understand it and implement it in our lives. Ameen. This para starts with verse number 83 of Surah Ma'idah, which is about a group of Christians who had accepted Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when they listen to what has been revealed to the messenger, you will see their eyes overflowing with tears for recognizing the truth. They say, Our Lord, we believe, so count us among the witnesses. Only the people who listen to Quran with an open heart are the ones who are affected by it. And they are the ones who will recognize the truth of Allah's words. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us in verse number 87, O you who have believed, do not prohibit the good things which Allah has made lawful for you, and do not exceed limits. Indeed, Allah does not like the transgressors. Here we are told that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides what's lawful and what's unlawful. Who are we to decide what halal and haram? It was up to the people to decide. Then every person would decide according to his or her own preference. And as a result, there would be chaos in the world. We are also told in this verse not to exceed limits. For example, trying to become too religious by leaving all worldly pleasures like the Christian monks or some Hindus or Buddhist priests. Now, does this mean that we should become the opposite of these kinds of people? No, a Muslim follows the middle path. We should have a balanced life. This world and its attractions have been made for us by our Lord. But remember that He has set some limits for us as well. Verse number 89 discourages us from making oaths about useless things and tells us if we break an intentional oath, then it has to be taken seriously and a kafara or a penalty has to be given for it. Next, verses 90 and 91 are really important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O believers, intoxicants, gambling, idols, and drawing lots of decisions are all evil of Shaitan's handiwork. So shun them so you may be successful. Let's first concentrate on the Arabic word khamar, which means that which covers the intellect, meaning an intoxicant. Now, a lot of people say, where is it written in the Quran that alcohol is haram? My answer to such people would be, please ask Google, what is alcohol an intoxicant? You will get your answer. What about drugs? Khamar or an intoxicant can be a drink, something a person smokes, smells, or puts in his mouth. Anything that overcomes the mind of a person is an intoxicant. Next, some people might ask, but what if it doesn't overcome the mind? Like if we use it in very small quantities. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, every intoxicant is unlawful, and whatever causes intoxication in large amount, a small amount of it is also unlawful. Next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions gambling. Gambling is an addiction where one gives up a normal, hard-working life in order to get some easy money. Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stop us from these things? Why does He call them the filthy works of Shaitan? Because He knows how harmful these things are for us. In verse number 100, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, say, not equal are the evil and the good, although the abundance of evil might impress you. This verse tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's standards of evaluation and judgment are very different from ours. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the people who love Allah, quantity doesn't make a difference. What matters is whether something is pure or impure. For food items, we know that tayyib food is that which is halal, while khabith is that which is haram and unclean. But is this verse only talking about food items? No, the criteria can be applied to all our actions. How many times do we see people following a trend just because everyone is doing it? We are told by this ayah that we are not to follow the majority, but we follow that which is right. We are told in verse 101 to avoid unnecessary and excessive questions, because they will only make it difficult for us to practice our deen. Then in verse 105, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O believers, you are accountable only for yourselves. It will not harm you if someone chooses to deviate, as long as you are rightly guided. This teaches us that we are responsible for our own actions. If the entire world is following that which is wrong, even then we won't follow them. We will and should continue to teach them what is right. But our primary focus should be our own journey. We have to know that if we are doing that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to do, then He will protect us and look after us. Surah Al-An'am. Surah Al-An'am was revealed in the last year before migration in Makkah. This surah contains the summary of the whole of the Meccan period and serves as an ultimatum to the kuffar. This surah begins with an introduction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "All praise is for Allah alone, who created the heavens and the earth and brought into being light and darkness. And yet, those who have rejected the call of the truth ascribe others to be equals to their Lord." Then in verse 6, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked the disbelievers if they had seen the faith of the other disbelieving nations before them. They were the people who had more strength and power than the Quraysh. But even then, they couldn't stop their own destruction. Now to challenge the corrupt beliefs of idol worshippers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "To whom belongs everything in the heavens and the earth? Who is the protector? Who is the provider?" We too need to ask ourselves these questions. And if we answer that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, the provider, the protector, then why don't I live my life according to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Who or what is stopping me from pleasing Him? We are then shown two contrasting scenes in verse number 25 to 31. One scene shows the kuffar where they listened to the Quran in this world. What did they say when these verses were recited to them? They said, "This Quran is nothing but ancient fables." The next scene shows the same people in the hereafter, where they will have extreme regret and will cry, "Oh, if only we could be sent back. We would never deny the signs of our Lord, and we would surely be of the believers." In verse 32, we learn about the reality of life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "The life of this world is nothing but a sport and a pastime, and the life of the hereafter is far better for those who fear Allah." Would you still not understand? Allah ta'ala is telling us here, this world is like a game that we play. We pass a little time, get amused by it, and suddenly it comes to an end. So how come we are spending more time for this temporary dunya than our everlasting akhirah? In verse number 42, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And we have already sent messengers to nations before you, O Muhammad. Then we seize them with poverty and hardship, that perhaps they might humble themselves to us." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us here why He put a difficulty in our lives. We generally see that when everything is going well, we forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and become arrogant. We stop making du'as and are so busy in our perfect lives that we forget that we were sent here with a purpose, with a mission. But the moment we are hurt, we immediately turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and call Him for help. The question is, why must we wait for a calamity to strike before we connect with our Lord? Verse 52 and 53 teach us that in Islam, there is no distinction between rich and poor. What matters is how much iman and righteousness a person has. Verse 54 is a huge blessing for us, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us of His mercy upon us and says that any of you who does wrong out of ignorance and then repents after that and corrects himself, indeed He is forgiving and merciful. Verse 68 gives us instructions and on what our action should be if we are ever in the company of such people who make fun of the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are told to leave such gatherings until they change their topic. How can we sit and listen to people making fun of someone we love? What if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishments comes at that exact time and we are a part of that gathering? What if we keep our company and become influenced by them as well? The amazing story of Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam begins from verse number 74. How he searched for signs and observed the whole universe, then recognized the truth about who his creator was. He did this when he was just a young man whose entire nation was involved in idol worship. As a result, his family kicked him out. His people threw him in fire, but he remained firm on his path. As a result, he was chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as his friend, Khalilullah. Imagine, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling him his friend. This teaches us that our sacrifices for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never go wasted. We will be blessed in this dunya and the next, inshallah. In verses 84 and 87, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the name of 17 of his prophets by name and tells us that He preferred them over all the world. How? By blessing them with prophethood and choosing them to be His messengers. Imagine our status in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we too become among those who spread the message of the Prophet. Next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us some signs of His power in verses 95 to 99. For example, the splitting of the seeds, the cycle of the night and the day, the beauty of the stars, the creation of mankind, and the rain from the sky. And yet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there are some who still associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This brings us to the end of the 7 juz and towards our question for the day. The question I will ask myself today is, what inspires me the most about Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam, and how will I try to instill that quality in my own self? Inshallah, we will meet again tomorrow with the next para.